kiddos, we're back in it. All right, so we're looking at chapter 29 and 30. That's where we're at today. I almost skipped a whole chapter. That would have been confusing, right? So we're on chapter 29 into chapter 30 today. Only 2 chapters again, so not too bad. And we're going to revisit zero because we've learned a lot about zero since last week, since the last time I had you answer this same question. So we're going to answer actually the exact same question again, but this time we know more about zero and we're about to learn a lot, okay? So what we're going to do again today is we're going to focus on zero. How is he thinking, acting, feeling, and speaking, okay? And specifically, we're going to ask ourselves, what do we think zero was thinking? What was zero saying? What was zero doing? And all of that combined together, how do we think zero was probably feeling, okay? And so remember, we know that characters, they think, act, feel, and speak. We use clues in the text to ask ourselves, how are they acting? How are they thinking? How are they speaking? And then I take a step back and I go, you know, if I'm acting that way, or if I was thinking that way, I'd probably be feeling blank, okay? If I was saying those things and slamming my door and screaming, I hate you, how am I probably feeling? I'm angry, right? So we use clues in the text about the character, okay? We use what we know about our own personal lives, and then we make a guess. We make an inference. And so remember, ask yourself these questions. How are they thinking? How are they acting? How are they speaking? And what does this tell them about how they feel? Okay, so today we're focusing on zero. All right, we're on chapter 29 on page 127. Now, if you've been following along with me in the book, one thing you notice between what we read yesterday and what we read today, what we're going to read today, there's this page right here and it says part 2, the last whole. This is the first time we have ever read a book as a class where it's broken into parts. There's actually one more part at the back of the book. So the author breaks this book into 3 parts. Now, this first part, that's when we start really learning about Stanley and the camp and really the story behind Camp Green Lake, right? About kissing Kate Barlow and Sam and buried treasure, maybe. Maybe that's what the warden's looking for. And today, we're starting our second part, which is called The Last Hole. What do you think this is probably going to focus on? I don't know. All right, chapter 29, page 127. There was a change in the weather, for the worse. The air became unbearably humid. Stanley was drenched in sweat. Beads of moisture ran down the handle of his shovel. It was almost as if the temperature had gotten so hot that air itself was sweating. Now, y'all, we live in Arkansas. We've seen this kind of weather before, right? You ever stepped outside in the summer and it's so hot, the air feels wet. Like you just feel it's like muggy and it's like somebody's pushing on you. Ugh, that's the worst kind of weather, okay? Imagine having to dig a 5-foot deep, 5-foot wide hole in that weather. Where was I at? A loud boom of thunder echoed across the empty lake. Now remember, this lake hasn't seen rain in 110 years, okay? So they're hearing thunder. What do you think the boys might be praying for? A storm was way off in the west, beyond the mountains. Stanley could count more than 30 seconds between the flash of lightning and the clap of thunder. That was how far away the storm was. Sound travels a great distance across a barren wasteland. Usually, Stanley couldn't see the mountains at this time of the day. The only time they were visible was just at sunup before the air became hazy. You ever seen something so hot, you ever stare at like a black asphalt, the road, and it's so hot that when you look at it, it almost looks like if the air is moving? Okay, it's because it's so hot, you're literally seeing the heat rise off of the road. And that's what Stanley says. It gets so hot that when you stare out there, the air seems like it's moving because it's so hot. Now, however, the sky was very dark off to the west, and every time the lightning flashed, the dark shape of the mountain would briefly appear. "Come on, rain!" shouted Armpit. "Blow this way!" "Maybe it'll rain so hard it will fill up the whole lake," said Squid. "We can go swimming." 40 days and 40 nights, said X-Ray. "Guess we better start building us an ark. Get 2 of each animal, right?" "Right," said Zigzag. 2 rattlesnakes, 2 scorpions, 2 yellow-spotted lizards. The humidity, or maybe the electricity in the air, had made Zigzag's head even more wild looking. His frizzy blonde hair stuck almost straight up. The horizon lit up with a huge web of lightning. In that split second, Stanley thought he saw an unusual rock formation on top of the mountain peak. The peak looked to him exactly like a giant fist, with the thumb sticking straight up. Then it was gone, and Stanley wasn't sure if he'd seen it or not. I found refuge on God's thumb. That was what his great-grandfather had supposedly said after Kate Barlow had robbed him and left him stranded in the desert. No one had ever knew what he meant by that. He was delirious when he said it. But how could he live for 3 weeks without food or water? Stanley had asked his father. I don't know, I wasn't there, replied his father. I wasn't born yet. My father wasn't born yet. My grandmother, your great-grandmother, was a nurse in the hospital where they treated him. He always talked about how she dabbed his forehead with a cool wet cloth. He said that's why he fell in love with her. He thought she was an angel. A real angel? His father didn't know. What about after he got better? Did he ever say what he meant by God's thumb or how he'd survived? No, he just blamed his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Well, I guess it was just stealing father. It wasn't his great-great-grandfather, right? Just his father. The storm moved off further west along with any hope of rain. But the image of the fist and thumb remained in Stanley's head. Although instead of lightning flashing behind the thumb in Stanley's mind, the lightning was coming out of the thumb, as if it was the thumb of God. Now remember the story, right? The author goes back and forth between 3 different periods. The first story it tells is of Stanley. The second story it tells is of Stanley's great-grandfather. Right? I'm pretty sure. That's who it is. The one who was robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow. And remember, Stanley kind of maybe thought when they found Kate Barlow's lipstick tube, maybe my grandfather, this is where he was robbed. Maybe he was robbed on Green Lake. And then he always said he found refuge on God's thumb. And now we know that Kissing Kate Barlow did live at Camp Green Lake because she was Catherine Barlow, the school teacher, and that's where she died by a yellow-spotted lizard. She had buried her treasure out there, and now Stanley's seeing a mountain with God's thumb on it. So all of our pieces are starting to fit together. All right, kiddos, chapter 30. This is really where we're going to focus on 0, okay? The next day was Zigzag's birthday, or so he said. Zigzag lay in his cot as everyone headed outside. I get to sleep in because it's my birthday. Then, a little while later, he cut in the breakfast line just in front of Squid. Squid told him to get to the end of the line. Hey, it's my birthday, Zigzag said, staying where he was. It's not your birthday, said Magnet, who was standing behind Squid. It's too, July 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone the date. It could have been July 8th, but how would Zigzag know? He tried to figure out how long he'd been at Camp Green Lake, if it was indeed July 8th. I came here on May 24th, he said aloud, so that means I've been here 46 days, said 0. Stanley was still trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He looked at 0. He learned not to doubt him when it came to math. 46 days. It felt more like 1,000. He didn't dig a hole that first day, and he hadn't dug one yet today. So that means he had only dug 44 holes, if it really was July 8th. Can I have an extra carton of juice? Zigzag asked Mr. Sir. It's my birthday. To everyone's surprise, Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. Hole number 45. The 45th hole is the hardest, he said to himself. But that really wasn't true, and he knew it. He was a lot stronger than when he'd first arrived. His body had adjusted somewhat to the heat and harsh conditions. Mr. Sir was no longer depriving him of water. After having to get by on less water for a week or so, Stanley now felt like he could have all the water he could want. Of course it helped that 0 dug some of his hole for him each day, but that wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He always felt awkward while Zero was digging his hole, unsure of what he was to do with himself. Usually he stood around a while before sitting off by himself on the hard ground, with the sun beating down on him. It was better than digging, though, but not a lot better. When the sun came up a couple hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God. The mountain was little more than dark shadows on the horizon. He thought he could make out the spot where the top of the mountain seemed to jut upward, but it didn't seem very impressive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden behind the glare of the sun reflecting off the dirty air. It was possible, he realized, that he was somewhere near where Kate Barlow had robbed his great-grandfather, if that was really her lipstick tube that he'd found. Then she must have lived somewhere around here. But what do we know? The author this is the great thing about third person. Stanley's not the one telling the story. We're seeing it through his eyes, but Stanley's not the one telling it. It's a narrator telling it, right? We know it's not Stanley because he's not saying things like, I was looking for the mountain. I was sitting by myself. It says things like he was looking for the mountain. But because the author goes and tells us a different part of the story, we already know that Kate Barlow lived there. We know she lived in that cabin with the 2 oak trees where the warden lives. Okay? Stanley doesn't know that, though. So as the reader, we get a little bit of knowledge that Stanley doesn't have, and we're like, she does live there, Stanley, she does. Or she did. I'm on page 132, kiddos. Zero took his turn before the lunch break. Stanley climbed out of his hole, and Zero climbed down into it. Hey, caveman, said Zigzag, you should get a whip. Then if your slave doesn't dig fast enough, you can crack it across his back. He's not my slave, said Stanley. We have a deal, that's all. A good deal for you. It was Zero's idea, not mine. Don't you know, Zig, said X-Ray coming over, Caveman's doing Zero a big favor. Zero likes to dig holes. He sure is a nice guy to let Zero dig his hole for him, said Squid. Well, what about me? Asked Armpit. I like to dig holes too. Can I dig for you, Caveman, after Zero's finished? The other boys laughed. The boys are being sarcastic, right? They're just trying to give Stanley a hard time because they're mad that Stanley gets to sit down an hour while Zero digs part of his hole. No, I want to, said Zigzag. It's my birthday. Stanley tried his best to ignore them. Zigzag kept at it. Come on, Caveman, be a pal. Let me dig your hole. Stanley smiled as if it was all a big joke. When Mr. Pendanski arrived with the water at lunch, Zigzag offered Stanley his place in line. Since you're so much better than me. Stanley remained where he was. I didn't say I was You're insulting him, Zig, said X-Ray. Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us, aren't you, Caveman? No, said Stanley. Sure you are, said X-Ray. Now come to the front of the line where you belong. That's okay, said Stanley. No, it's not okay, said X-Ray. Get up here. Stanley hesitated, then moved to the front of the line. Well, this is a first, Mr. Pendanski said, coming around the side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed him a sack lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad that he'd been digging his own hole for the rest of the day. Maybe the other boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole for him anymore. But he needed to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into a sandwich, which contained some kind of meat and cheese mixture that came out of a can. Just about everything at Camp Green Lake came out of a can. The supply truck only came once a month. He glanced up to see Zigzag and Squid walking toward him. I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole, said Zigzag. Squid laughed. Here, take my cookie, said Zigzag, holding it out for him. No thanks, said Stanley. Come on, take my cookie, said Zigzag, sticking it into his face. Leave me alone, said Stanley. Please eat my cookie, said Zigzag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away. Zigzag pushed him back. Don't push me. I didn't. Stanley got to his feet. He looked around. Mr. Pendanski was filling Zero's canteen. Zigzag pushed him again. I said, don't push me. Stanley took a step backward, carefully avoiding Zero's hole. Zigzag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, quit pushing. Is Stanley pushing him? No, the boys are just all mad, and they're taking it out on Stanley, and now things have just gotten too heated, and things are just going too far. Lay off, said Armpit as he, Magnet, and X-Ray joined them. Why should he? Snapped X-Ray. Caveman's bigger. He can take care of himself. I don't want any trouble, Stanley said. Zigzag pushed him hard. Eat my cookie, he said. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Pendanski coming toward them along with Zero. Hi, Mom, said Armpit. We're just fooling around. I saw what was going on, Mr. Pendanski said. He turned to Stanley. Go ahead, Stanley, he said. Hit him back. You're bigger. What would you guys do if y'all were on the playground and y'all were shoving each other and I walked over and instead of putting it into it, I was like, hit him back. Go ahead. Hit him. What would you guys do? Stanley stared at Mr. Pendanski in astonishment. Teach the bully a lesson, said Mr. Pendanski. Zigzag hit Stanley on the shoulder with an open hand. Teach me a lesson, he challenged. Stanley made a feeble attempt to punch Zigzag. That's like, a feeble attempt is like a really sad attempt, like it wasn't a very good one. Then he felt a fury of fists against his head and neck. Zigzag had hold of his collar with one hand and was hitting him with the other. The collar ripped and Stanley fell backward into the dirt. That's enough, Mr. Pendanski yelled. It wasn't enough for Zigzag. He jumped on top of Stanley. Stop, shouted Mr. Pendanski. The side of Stanley's face was pressed flat against the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zigzag's fist slammed onto his arms and pounded his face into the ground. All he could do was wait for it to be over. Then suddenly Zigzag was off him. Stanley managed to look up and he saw that Zero had his arm around Zigzag's long neck. So Zero most likely has him like this. Like if I'm Zigzag, and this would be Zero's arm. And Zero has Zigzag by the neck like that. Zigzag made a gagging sound as he desperately tried to pry Zero's arm off of him. You're gonna kill him, shouted Mr. Pendanski. Zero kept squeezing. Armpit charged into them, freeing Zigzag from Zero's chokehold. The three boys fell to the ground in different directions. Mr. Pendanski fired his pistol into the air. The other counselors came running from the office, the tent, or out on the lake. They had their guns drawn, but holstered them when they saw that the trouble was over. The warden walked over from her cabin. There was a riot, Mr. Pendanski told her. Zero almost killed Ricky. The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. Then she turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. What happened to you? Nothing. It wasn't a riot. Ziggy was beaten up on the caveman, said Armpit. Then Zero started choking Zigzag, and I had to pull Zero off of Zigzag. It was all over before Mom fired his gun. They just got a little hot, that's all, said X-Ray. You know how it is, in the sun all day. People get hot, right? But everything's cool now. Why are all the boys trying to be like, no, it's no big deal, it's no big deal? It's because they're a little scared of the warden, right? Honestly, I'm a little scared of the warden. I see, the warden said. She turned to Zigzag. What's the matter? Didn't you get a puppy for your birthday? Zig's just a little hot, said X-Ray, out in the sun all day. You know how it is. The blood starts to boil. Is that what happened, Zigzag? Asked the warden. Yeah, said Zigzag. Like X-Ray said, working so hard in the hot sun while Caveman just sits around doing nothing. My blood boiled. Excuse me, said the warden. Caveman digs his holes just like everybody else. Zigzag shrugged. Sometimes. Excuse me? Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day, said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to 0. I'm teaching him how to read and write, said Stanley. It's sort of a trade. The hole still gets dug, so what's it matter who digs it? Excuse me, said the warden. Isn't it more important for him to learn to read? Stanley asked. Doesn't that build character more than digging holes? That's his character, said the warden. What about your character? Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden turned to 0. Well, 0, what have you learned so far? 0 said nothing. Have you just been digging Caveman's hole for nothing? The warden asked him. He likes to dig holes, said Mr. Pendanski. Tell me what you learned yesterday, said the warden. Surely you can remember that. 0 said nothing. Mr. Pendanski laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, You might as well try to teach this shovel to read. It's got more brains than 0. The at sound, said 0. The at sound, repeated the warden. Well then, tell me, what does C-A-T spell? 0 glanced around uneasily. Stanley knew he knew the answer. 0 just didn't like answering questions. Cat, 0 said. Mr. Pendanski clapped his hands. Bravo, bravo, the boy's a genius. F-A-T, asked the warden. 0 thought a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. F, 0 whispered. F-A-T. Fat. How about H-A-T? Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound yet either. 0 concentrated hard and then said, Chat. All the counselors laughed. He's a genius, all right, said Mr. Pendanski. He's so stupid, he doesn't even know he's stupid. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pendanski seemed to have it in for 0. If Mr. Pendanski only thought about it, he'd realize it was very logical for 0 to think that the letter H made the CH sound. All right, kids, this is where I want you to start focusing in, okay? We're about to get to this part where we're going to learn a lot about 0. So how's he speaking? How's he acting? How's he thinking? Okay, I want you to be thinking about that right now. Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's hole, said the warden, and no more reading lessons. I'm not digging another hole, said 0. Good, said the warden. She turned to Stanley. You know why you're digging holes? Because it's good for you. It teaches you a lesson. If 0 digs your hole for you, then you're not learning your lesson, are you? I guess not, Stanley mumbled, although he knew they weren't just digging for a lesson. She was looking for something that belonged to Kissin' Kate Barlow. Why can't I dig my own hole, but still teach 0 how to read, he asked. What's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that, the warden said. It leads to trouble. 0 almost killed Zigzag. It causes him stress, said Mr. Pendanski. I know you mean well, Stanley, but face it, 0's too stupid to learn to read. That's what makes his blood boil, not the hot sun. I'm not digging another hole, said 0. Mr. Pendanski handed him the shovel. Here, take it, 0. It's all you'll ever be good for. 0 took the shovel. Then he swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blade smashed across Mr. Pendanski's face. His knees crumpled beneath them. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The counselors all drew their guns. 0 held the shovel out in front of him as if he were going to try to bat away the bullets. I hate digging holes, he said. Then he slowly backed away. We're getting good information here. Don't shoot him, said the warden. He can't go anywhere. The last thing we need is an investigation. 0 kept backing up, out past the cluster of holes the boys had been digging, then further and further out onto the lake. He's going to have to come back for water, the warden said. Stanley noticed 0's canteen laying on the ground near his hole. A couple of the counselors helped Mr. Pendanski to his feet and into the truck. Stanley looked out toward Zero, but he had disappeared into the haze. The warden ordered the counselors to take turns guarding the shower room and the rec room all day and all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water. When he returned, he was to be brought directly to her. She examined her fingernails. It's almost time for me to paint my nails again. Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of Group D that she still expected 7 holes. All right, kiddos, so we know how Zero was acting. We know how he was speaking. I want you to kind of infer, how do you think he was probably thinking? And all of that together, what he just did, how do you think he probably feels after all of that? Okay, that's your assignment for today. Woo, y'all, stuff's about to get good. Remember, this part of the book is called The Last Hole. So let's see if that really was going to be Zero's last hole. We're about to see. Okay? All right. I love you guys. I miss you guys. Again, if you need help, let me know. Send me a message. Comment on Google Classroom, whatever you need to do. And then remember, kiddos, there is a mini lesson on how to fill this graphic organizer out. Please watch it. Please watch it. Okay? I love y'all. I miss y'all, and I'll see you later.